Hello, Year 12 students. We're about to enter part 3 of Ransom, and this first section is from page 111 to 129. And just to remind you, part 3, the subheading I give it is Journey to the Greek Camp. And we met Somax at the end of part 2, the end of last section, the ordinary man, the carter, who was given or tasked with the job of transporting the treasure and King Priam to the Greek camp. And so we start our action right on dusk. And in part 3, what you'll notice is it actually jumps from Somax's perspective to Priam's perspective. And and if you're paying attention, you'll notice the jump when they actually use the character's name for the first time in the narration, where David Malouf does that, and he'll actually switch. So we get to watch through Somax's eyes how he views Priam. And then, because he is an ordinary man viewing the king. And then we see through Priam's eyes as a king how he sees the ordinary man and the ordinary man's life. And we get a real insight through those two, the juxtaposition of the two characters in this section. So the technique that you'd be looking for is juxtaposition of the point of view. So the third person limited narration. So the third person limited narration, basically, the limited section means that it's omniscient, but, so omniscient narrator. But what has happening is when we jump into Somax's point of view, we see through his eyes, and we jump into Priam's point of view, we see through his eyes. It's omniscient narration is the whole book itself. Anyway. So this section and the page 111 through to 121 is a section where it's basically the banks of the Scamander River, and they stop at the banks of the river, and the two men dangle their feet in the water. And there's a few other things happening around that, but basically if you have that image as your central image for this section, it's based around these two men dipping their feet in the water and some conversations that happen around that. So we'll start with our summary and analysis. So basically they have arrived at the river on page 111 and page 112. It starts off with Somax's perspective. He gets down from the cart. He extends his hand for Priam to get down as well. And the king continued to sit. The driver, this is Somax's narration, thinks that he'll get an awful pain in his back if he goes on sitting like that. This idea that the king's, even his posture is stiff, which represents his world. And the king says, I'll just stay here in the wagon with the body of my son. And then Somax realizes that the king's thoughts have leapt ahead. They've already kind of arrived, and this treasure represents the body of his son. And here, top of page 113, I think is a fairly significant quote for you to file away. So very tactfully, his heart, Somax's heart, is softened by fellow feeling, since he too was a father. Okay, and so he pretends he is misheard. Okay, there's this commonality, and there's a sense of understanding that's created through this mutual identity of fatherhood, and then he assures him, well, the treasure, beauty, his favourite donkey, his favourite mule, will keep an eye on the donkey. And the driver chuckles and assures him that, don't worry, the treasure will be looked after. And then here, at the bottom of 113, okay, Somax reaches up to take Priam's hand, and at this, Priam has this unaccustomed touch, and it occurred to him, Somax, that he may have committed some sort of affront to the king's sacred person by offering him his hand. And what I've written here as my notes is that Priam's never actually been treated like a man before. He's only been treated like a king. So his sacred person, that nobody's actually ever acknowledged his identity as an ordinary man, okay? But rather than being offended, he's actually, Priam seems grateful. And he thanks Somax and allows himself to be brought down from the cart. And the carter, Somax, says, "That's it, my lord. You'll see. We'll have a nice rest here, maybe even a bite to eat." He's sowing that seed because he's quite hungry because he hasn't eaten anything since dawn. And he leads the king down through the soft sand to the water's edge. There's almost the way that the carter is talking to him. You can even see the tone here, and it's acknowledged directly later on. But there's this, I say patronizing, and I don't mean this in a negative way. I mean almost like addressing a child, like leading a small child. And Somax begins by twisting the robe, hoiking it up to his knees, and then in his sandals, he just walks into the stream, and he describes the still water and the fingerlings. I think these are like tiny little fish that have come to investigate his feet. And I just have written on the side here, this innocent, joyful pleasure of standing in this still water. And it's something that we can all remember, the feeling of just wading into water up until over our ankles. And then the carter puts his hands on his knees, leans over to talk to the little fish. "Hello, little ones," he calls. Okay. And they already decided he's not of interest. And so Priam is looking at him, uncertain and out of place, watching. And from Somax's perspective, he says, he's like a child, he thought, a bit on the slow side. So this is a significant moment with Somax's view of the king. Because the king has never been exposed to this realm, the way that he views the world, he's so innocent, he's so childlike. Whoa. There you go, childlike. Like he's sleepwalking is the description at the bottom there. And so Somax kind of talking to himself here. It's like, well, the king, who's such like a child, is not going to give me any orders. So what do I do here? And he thinks, well, what if I really was Idios? How would I have acted then? And he's only ever had something to do with simple folk like himself, people who eat sheep's cheese, raw garlic, and there's a description of the types of simple, ordinary life, ordinary activities that he is familiar with. People that say, "Hey, Granddad, where you off to?" Okay. So now he decides he's going to have to rely on his wit to his logic, I guess, his experience, to apply to this situation here. So 116 we're at now. At 116. How come? So from the top of 116, he says, "Look, Priam, King Priam, you'll feel better, sir, if you come on and do what I do. Dabble your feet a little. The coolness of the water will buck you up, no end. It's a good hour till sundown, and we'll go safer on the other side if we wait till dark." And the king is startled, as if this voice had come from nowhere. But Somax, the driver, bolder now, he thinks, well, I've already begun, I better go on. And he kneels on the bank, and since the king offers no resistance, he's simply looking down, he unlaces the sandals of King Priam. And here is another description, and it's kind of an extended metaphor that is used of Priam being like a child. So here he's like an obedient toddler. Priam lifts one foot and the other until the sandals are off, and then he glances towards the driver, who urges him on. He takes 3 uncertain steps into the stream, and he feels this cooling effect, and he smiles, and he stares down at his naked feet. And the note I've written to the side, he is experiencing this joy, this childlike joy of simple pleasures for the first time in his life. And he observes the fish, those slivers of light that come in, and they're nudging and tickling his feet, and they find the royal feet every bit as disappointing and without interest as the drivers. So that from the perspective of the slivers, these little fish, there is no difference between a king and a commoner. And I definitely think this is an intentional insertion by David Malouf to show the commonality or the common experience, common humanity perhaps, between king and carter. And at this point, it shifts to Priam's perspective. And this is a really tricky one because there's no obvious marker to indicate the shift. But he starts describing this rough fellow, this companion he had chosen. And it's here we see the first mention of Priam's name. This man has no notion of what's proper. He does not know his way about. With so much simple modesty and goodwill in the man, so much tact in the way he's made his suggestions, that Priam finds nothing objectionable in him. It wasn't reverence that Somax lacked, but a knowledge of the formality. Okay. So he's good-natured, basically, is what I think it's getting at here. And so he indicates to Somax he can sit down, and they both enjoy the water, the simple pleasure of the water. And Somax brings a leather satchel and opens up this leather packet. Page 118. He says, "Come on, let's have a bite to eat, my lord. We're not going to have another opportunity. We've got a good journey. Just a mouthful to keep your strength up." Now, Priam shakes his head. He denies this. The carter has lunch that's been packed, or dinner, and there's griddle cakes. And griddle cakes is a symbol that you may want to take note of. It's one that I've got on my word wall in my classroom. As a symbol. So what it means by griddle cakes is basically like mini pancakes. We also call them pikelets, okay? And they represent the ordinariness of life. So Priam refers to this man as his idiot. He looks at them regretfully. He says, "Please eat them." And so Somax is quite hungry. He starts eating one. And then Somax starts to chatter. He says, "Well, these are pikelets, they call them. griddle cakes were made by my daughter-in-law, and he describes how the pikelets are made from buckwheat flour and a drop of oil and the colour of the buttermilk. And here on 119, the rest of, there's a detailed description of making these griddle cakes, and he talks about how his son, God's rest him, remember his children are all passed away, set up these stones or the like the griddle to help his wife, his daughter-in-law. And so this whole thing is a description of his daughter-in-law making the cakes, flipping the cakes, watching the mixing the ingredients, and watching the cakes cook, flipping them, and using her fingers to flip them, which is a trick because she doesn't want to burn them. And if she burns them, she pops them in her mouth, and you can taste the lightness. I've eaten 20 of these in a sitting. The flavor comes from the buttermilk. I mean, you can imagine him. It's almost like, talking out of nerves, but he's filling the silence with chatter. Later on, Priam calls it prattle. So they talk about Somex talks about the griddle cakes and offers, "Are you sure you don't just want one?" Priam says no, and then he offers, "Well, have a drink of wine instead." And so Priam decides to have a small sip because he's actually rather thirsty or rather dry. And he makes a subtle, kind suggestion. Okay, a fellow like me, I have to know what's good for the body as well as the spirit. He makes this suggestion at the top of 121. Okay, now, because you've had some wine, you should really have a bite of something to eat. Okay, we need to be practical to help your body as well as your spirit. And so Priam, who does feel a little faint, allows himself to be persuaded, and he takes one of these little cakes in his fingers. He breaks open a morsel, a little bite, and he tastes it. And he says it does taste good. And the driver, what the driver says of his lightness was true, and its effects on his spirit. He finished the cake, but doesn't have a second. Abstemiousness was native in him. That means doing things in moderation or denying oneself. And so he's used to denying himself. And he reflects here at the bottom of 121, when he sets out on this business, he'd understood that he would be exposing himself to things that he'd not previously encountered. This is the price of the new. And I like this quote. This could be a subheading too, the price of the new. For King Priam, this is an incredibly new activity. Sitting down at the banks of the Scamander River and drinking, chatting, having ordinary conversation, the fish, all of these things. But now he has this golden taste of pancake in his mouth. He sees that what was new could also be pleasurable. And he's really enjoying this moment of sitting with his feet in the cooling water. And at the bottom of 122, he reflects that these things are not really new in themselves. The water, the fish, all of these things, they've always been there. But till now, he had no occasion to take notice of him. They were not in the royal sphere, in his realm, okay? So he never noticed common things before. And he describes his importance was the official activity that was part of any event. This royal pose was important. So when he went out on a boar hunt, he explains 123, each had a role to play. There's, he describes a boar hunt, the dog handlers, the beaters, like all of them had a role in hunting this boar, wild pig. And then somebody symbolically makes this kill, and he's at the center, but he's actually not involved in this physical business. And the boar at the end is his, it's presented to him, and it's a very formal process. And he talks about somehow with the god's assent, this fattens his spirit it's a mystery. It's a word of ceremony. And that's another good quote. The importance of ceremony in the world of a king, the ceremony of high play. This world that's eternal had nothing to do with the actual and immediate, the ordinary world. And even this boar, this king, it's all a world of symbolism, of ceremony. He talks about the fact that the realm of the royal was representational, ideal. Okay. And what is left to be ignored is the world of the incidental and the ordinary. And his whole life has been like this. And now he discovers that everything was just itself. It's not representing anything. This is what's new. Okay. And in being just itself, neither more nor less, not representing everything, each thing appears to him in a form that he doesn't even recognize. And I certainly noticed that Priam going to Achilles as just himself, neither more nor less, just who he is the thing that is new. There's something new. And that's another good quote for you to learn. And so a subheading could be something new. Okay. And he's now bewildered, but he finds it not unpleasurable. Okay. He's noticing these things for the first time. And he says, would this have been possible if he had the other Idios? It's because this new man, Somax, that he has actually experienced this through him. And he finds himself chuckling because the fact that this fellow, Somax, lets his tongue run on with no fear of being taken for a mere rattle or a chatterer. In his world, okay, he says what Somax has to say is unnecessary. It has no point or use. But it did so little harm, none at all, to this fellow's dignity. And there's something here, Priam thinks, that he needs to rethink about. Okay? In his world, a man only speaks to give shape to decisions that he's come to lay out an argument, to offer thanks or a reproof. That means like a criticism or tell somebody off, to pay a compliment with decorative phrases, appeals to vanity. So there was a purpose in every word that he would say. Silence, not speech, was what was expressive. Power lay in containment, in keeping hidden, therefore mysterious one's true intent. A child might prattle till it learnt better. Okay. Or women might prattle in the seclusion of their own apartments. But out here, he says, if you stop to listen, everything prattled. It was a prattling world. Leaves, water, cicadas, like the world wasn't actually silent at all. It was silent, but then it wasn't silent at all. There was a prattling that happened in the world. It was rustling and buzzing and humming, and this mule driver, his Idios, he doesn't actually even know his real name, but anyway, what he has to say was of no importance. It was full of something else, interest. And so it is as if he's found himself peering through the crack of the door, okay, and saw into this fellow's life, his world, and the world of his daughter-in-law. And he thinks about these little cakes that Somax has described and the ingredients that went into them, okay, and the convenient device, the man's son, the stones that he'd come up with to make things easier for the girl who cooked them. And it never occurred to him that the food that came to his table might have ingredients. Note the use of italics there. Okay, he never even thought about food. It's a mundane, ordinary. So therefore, the griddle cakes represent this mundane, ordinary world. That a griddle cake or a pikelet might have some previous form as batter. That batter might consist of buckwheat flour and buttermilk. That's good quality. And what we experience as goodness, so what he experienced as a good food, may depend on the thickness of the batter. So all of this stuff is like discovering for the first time. He's seeing through Somax's eyes, and he's never been concerned about this before. It held no interest for him, but now it did. So he looks at these old fellow who has shown him these new things with a growing respect, and he realizes that Somax knows things. the life he'd come from, with full of activities and facts that, even though they're common and low, they had an appeal. He knows things like the colour of the buttermilk. He knows things like how to make the buttermilk and to watch her cakes, flip them over, and when he did that, putting her hands in her mouth so she doesn't get burnt, and that was very lively and real. He could see it through his description of Somax's description, even though he'd never seen her. And he wants more of this experience. He needs to know whether this girl is meager or on the plump side. Does she dress her hair? And so he gets a curiosity about real things. So he wants to have an image of her. And so it leads to something very unaccustomed indeed, which is talking, asking questions. He wishes to ask the man some questions that were not necessary, that served no purpose, but scratching an itch, curiosity. And so he asks a question to Somax. So you too have been blessed with sons. And we're going to stop it there. In this next section from 130, we'll go on with Somax's story of his sons and how his sons... So there's a bit of more of Somax's life in the next section. We're going to stop it there at the end of 129 and leave it to you to take some notes from here. Good luck, and we'll see you in the next video.